Shalom. Welcome. I'm Rabbi Scott with Beth Yeshua Messianic Synagogue in Fort Myers, Florida. We are reissuing the Revelation series that was taught by Rabbi Jim Pickens here at Beth Yeshua over the course of the last 2 years or so. We feel these messages are especially relevant in these tumultuous times, and we hope and pray that Adonai uses them to strengthen you and to encourage you. If you are currently a supporter of this ministry, we would like to say thank you. We appreciate your partnership with us as we all labor together in the work of the gospel of Yeshua in the kingdom here on earth. If you would like to support us, you will find a link below in the video description. Once again, we hope that this is a blessing to you. If you have any questions, you will find an email address. If you have any dialogue or discussion, you'll find an email address in the video description below. Please reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. And now I will give you the Revelation series with Rabbi Jim Pickens. Shalom.
Okay. We're going to get into some really interesting stuff this evening. One of the things that we're going to get into that we really need to just absolutely thoroughly have all kinds of attention paid to is the fact that we're going to begin to talk about Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus the Fourth Epiphanes, is the best pre-picture of the coming false Messiah at the end of the age that there is. And it's going to be, really pretty fantastic when we get into this. We're also going to go through some scripture here that is, as best I can lay it out for you, this scripture that we're going to get into this evening has the absolute most detail of any scripture that there really is as we go through all of the Bible. It lays things out in extreme exact detail, and we can prove that because we've seen the history of the main part that we're going to look at this evening. We've seen the history of that play itself out exactly as it was laid out. Now, Daniel was given this as he was meeting with this angelic being. This was his fourth vision, and he's being given this information by this angelic being around the 5th century BC. And as we get into the 3rd through the 1st century BC, we see all of these things that are laid out here in order beginning to fall in place, just exactly like it's pointed out in Scripture. And what I'm basically going to do for you this evening is to go through a bunch of the Scripture verse by verse. Then I'm going to show you what happened in history, and a lot of the history that's available to us comes to us through the Apocrypha, through the various writings to the Maccabees. And I've got one of them here. I've got several of these here in case you've never looked at the Maccabees before. But one of them I'm going to point out in particular to you to look at and actually read what it says in there. Plus the fact that there's just all kinds of stuff, history that's available to us now that wasn't available like just 20 years ago even. There's kind of a first section of this 11th chapter of Daniel that we're going to look at, and it's verses 2 through 23, and they describe in order the great Persian rulers, Persia being the second of the 4 Gentile empires, and it also gives a lot of real good detail for us on the 3rd Gentile empire, which is Greece, beginning with Alexander the Great and going through that until we arrive at Antiochus the fourth, who called himself Theos Epiphanes. And he ruled from roughly 175 to 164. But this prophecy was all given back in the 5th century. So it's pure prophetic. And of course, there are those out there today who will say, well, it couldn't have been that accurate, so it had to have been written later on. Okay? What I want to show you is, I think it was given to Daniel. I think it was given to him by that angel, because God, the Creator, knows everything that is going to occur from the day of creation until the day that we go off to be with Him in eternity. He knows every little detail. Now, Antiochus Epiphanes was the one that was involved in the desecration of the temple, out of which comes the Feast of Rededication, which we commonly call Hanukkah. Hanukkah is a picture of the temple being desecrated, the temple being renewed and rebuilt and put back in order. And this happens just shortly before the first coming of Messiah. And it's a picture of the man, the coming false Messiah, who will be the final ruler of the fourth empire of man. Antiochus Epiphanes was almost in effect the final ruler of the third empire of man. And he is a picture. I'm really pouncing on this. He's really a picture of this coming false Messiah. We need to be aware that the entire time frame from the death of Antiochus Epiphanes all the way to the end of days is skipped over by Daniel. Daniel shuts it down at the end of Antiochus Epiphanes and moves straight over to pick up the false Messiah at the end of the age. Now, we'll get the details of everything that's going to take place between Antiochus Epiphanes and the coming of the false Messiah at the end of the age when we get into Revelation itself. Third chapter of Revelation in particular talks about sections of things that happened in various places that are pictures for us of the time frame from when Yeshua ascended until he returns. Well, the rest of Daniel chapter 11, then, after verse 35, from verse 36 through verse 45, deals with the final pagan ruler of the final pagan empire, who will have just been pictured for us in Antiochus Epiphanes, ending in that 35th verse with the new information about the guy that he was type and foreshadow of, beginning in the 36th chapter. This then is followed by chapter 12, which is further prophecy about the final 1,335 days, period including the Great Tribulation, the second coming of Messiah, and the beginning of the Fifth Empire, which is the millennial kingdom, 1,000-year kingdom of Messiah. Probably no place else in Scripture presents more minutely detailed prophecy. Daniel 11, 2 through 35, and we're going to look at that in detail. We're going to look at it in enough detail that we're not really probably going to get all the way through these first 35 verses this evening. This first section of Scripture has prompted the sharpest attacks of any critics of Scripture by those trying to discredit this particular prophetic portion. It's the 11th chapter of Daniel with its detailed prophecy about the 300-year period of history that prompted a heathen philosopher named Porphyry in the 3rd century BC Common Era to attack the book of Daniel as a forgery. In his study, Porphyry established the concept that the course of history corresponded so closely to the prophetic revelation of Daniel 12, 2 through 35 that the prophecy so precisely corresponded to actual history that went on that no prophet could have been that accurate. So it had to be a forgery made after the fact. after these events occurred, Daniel had to have written about them, and then did that in the 2nd century. Modern critics of Daniel have not really gone much beyond his statements and writings, that so much detailed prophecy is just impossible. In effect, what these critics are doing is rejecting God's sovereign rule, which is the most basic premise that Daniel projects to us. That the Most High God has sovereign rule over all the nations of the world. We have to keep our focus on that. The Most High God has sovereign rule over all the nations of the earth. And as we go through this, we have to see these points that we're going to look at in order to keep our focus on this. So we're going to be talking about plots, intrigues, marriages of convenience that consolidate power, murders as we go through history. These things we're going to look at would rival some of the best soap operas that you have ever seen or heard in your life. And these are detailed in Daniel before they happen. At the end of the previous chapter, Daniel chapter 10 and verse 21, we were introduced to what is called a book of truth. Book of truth, or the writings of truth, which are being revealed to Daniel, to us, through this angelic being. Here in these pages are at least a portion of this writings of truth, this revelation coming from heavenly writings, not a text on earth, but being laid out for us in order to see this. And we talked about in the fact that God has not given us everything that he has got written down. As an example, in Revelation, when the thunders came and John started to write that down, God said, no, seal that up till it's time for it to be revealed. So we don't have all the information that God has laid out as he's written out everything from Adam to us being with him in eternity. Now, in this book of truth, we see that God has laid out a course of history as he sees it coming. And the thing we have to remember as we go through this is, as these men murder one another with great abandon, just as an example, God didn't direct that murder to happen. He didn't say, this has got to happen. But he did know that it was going to happen and wrote down that it was going to happen because man still has free will. And of course, God is omniscient. I want to quote something that I think sets this omniscience forth perfectly. It's from a 3rd century rabbi, Abba Akiva. He put this into 8 words very perfectly. Quote, all is foreseen and free will is given. Keep this in mind as we go through this portion of Scripture. All right, let's get started. Daniel 11, verse 2 through 4, please, ma'am. It says, this is the angel talking to Daniel. What I'm going to tell you now is true. 3 kings will arise in Persia, followed by a 4th, who will be far wealthier than all of them. And when he has grown strong by means of his wealth, he will stir up everyone against the kingdom of Greece. Then a powerful king will appear who will rule a vast kingdom and do whatever he pleases. Next. But once he appears, his kingdom will be broken up and divided to the 4 winds of heaven. It won't be inherited by his descendants. It won't be ruled with power that he had, because his kingship will be uprooted and will pass on to others than his own posterity, his own kinfolks. This is really what this supernatural being, this angel, is telling Daniel. He's telling Daniel from the book of the writings of truth that's in heaven, and this begins with tracing 4 Persian rulers. 4 Persian rulers. Now remember, Daniel's getting this a couple of hundred years before these things actually begin to take place and begin to get laid out. And he begins with tracing the 4 Persian rulers and bringing them up to Alexander the Great, the first of the Greek rulers. And we'll then get into specific details beyond Alexander of the Ptolemies of Egypt and the Seleucids of Syria, who were the two successors in Alexander the Great's Grecian Empire. In verse 2, the angel begins with the words, "What I am going to tell you now is true." I'm going to tell you the truth, Daniel. This is what's coming. This is referring to what will actually come to pass in the future. Then Daniel is informed that there will be 3 kings in Persia, followed by a 4th, and this 4th king will be far richer than any of his predecessors. This 4th king will then use these riches and his great power to stir up everyone in Persia against the kingdom of Greece. That's all written into that first passage. Now, we don't start counting these kings with Darius or Cyrus. These are 4 kings that are coming after Cyrus, who was then the one that was ruling. And historically, the 4 kings then are Cambyses, who ruled from 529 to 522. He was the son of Cyrus. Then this gets interesting because some of the history texts skip directly to the next Darius and then to Xerxes, who was the king that stirred up the Greeks. This only gives us, however, 3 kings. And so what's the deal? 3 kings instead of 4. Well, there was another king in there that are called by some Pseudo-Smerdis. Pseudo-Smerdis, who ruled Persia for 8 months from the death of Cambyses in 522 or 521. This 4th king, Cyrus, had another son, Smerdis. Cambyses was his brother, according to Greek historian Herodotus. And the Persian king Darius's account on an inscription, it says the same thing. Smerdis murdered Cambyses, but Cambyses, was successfully impersonated by someone called Gamata. Gamata was a magi. Magi is the term where we get a magician from. Magi's were a caste in the Middle East at that time. When Cambyses died in 522, the Pseudo-Smerdis seized the throne, posing as the brother of Cambyses, who had just left us. This usurper reigned for only 8 months before he was slain by Darius and other nobles suspicious of his origins. More modern historians think it was really Smerdis who took the throne to succeed his brother, and Darius killed him and then invented the Gamata, the Pseudo-Smerdis story, to justify his actions. So anyway, there's a king that some historians miss, but God caught him here. There will be these 4 kings. Xerxes is the 4th king in the prophecy. He reigned from 486 to 465, himself murdered in 465. He's mentioned in Ezra 4:6, if you would like to go read that area, Ezra 4:6. Xerxes amassed great wealth, and he prepared a huge army over a 4-year period, in fact, one of the largest armies in antiquity, and he did this in order to invade Greece. He invaded Greece in 480. The expedition against Greece ended in a disaster for Persia. It's interesting for us to note that this expedition against Greece probably took place between the 1st and 2nd chapters of Esther. Xerxes was the king that was involved in Esther. Just sort of file that one away for the next Purim. It will help us keep Purim's niche in history. Purim occurred in the time frame when Medo-Persian Empire invaded Greece and was beaten back. The legacy of this attack by Persia on Greece is really the cause of this underlying hatred of Alexander the Great for Persia, which we looked at in chapter 8. So the thing is that in defeating the Persian Empire, Alexander was simply repaying Xerxes for his attack on Greece. That's what prompted him to come in and make this attack. Alexander the Great was indeed, as we know from history, a mighty king. And this description that he had a vast kingdom, could do anything that he wanted to, is absolutely correct. Fits Alexander perfectly. Now, if we remember that when we went through chapter 8, there was a ram and there was a goat, and this goat went through a succession of stages. It was a goat with one horn, and then he had 4 horns, and then there was a little horn that was involved with this goat. The ram, of course, was Medo-Persia, and the goat was the Greek Empire. In Daniel 8:8, Alexander dies prematurely. He died while he was still growing strong and ascending in power. Alexander finished his campaign against Persia in 334 BC, or began it in 334 BC and finished it in 331. Persia was an enormous empire, and it had an enormous army. And for Alexander to be able to do this in that very short period of time is pointing to the fact of God's hand, I believe, being involved in things that are going on. At the age of 32, in 323, Alexander died. The big horn was broken off then of that goat, and the prophecy that his kingdom shall be broken and divided to the 4 winds of heaven was literally fulfilled by the 4 horns that came on there. After his death, his kingdom was divided into 4 generals, the 4 horns. His empire didn't go to his posterity, to his heirs, which is usually the case because Alexander's son Hercules was murdered. That's the way we got rid of everybody, is we killed them. Why? Alexander's son Hercules would have succeeded Alexander, but there were those that didn't want him to do that. They wanted to succeed. And then Alexander had a younger son, Alexander, born to Roxana right after his death, who was also murdered in 310. So this part of the prophecy given about 536 was fulfilled when Alexander died in 323. And we can really see the accuracy of these few words in Scripture given to Daniel as we go through history, as we see all the intrigue and murder as men are struggling to gain power in these kingdoms. Moving ahead, Daniel 11:5, please. The king of the south will be strong, and one of his princes will gain power over him and have dominion. His dominion will be a great dominion. Of the 4 divisions of Alexander's kingdom, only 2 would prove to have any kind of significance in the ancient world. As we look at it, the division headquartered in Egypt was ruled by the Ptolemies. The division headquartered in Syria was ruled by the Seleucids. The ruler of Egypt, the Ptolemy, was called the king of the south. The king of the south will be strong, it says here. And one of his princes will gain power over him. See, the ruler in Syria, the Seleucid, is called the king of the north as we progress through this. And this had to do with their locations relative to Israel. King of the north, king of the south. One was north, one was south of Israel. The king of the south in verse 5 was Ptolemy the first, Sultar, who ruled from 323 to 285. The king of the north was Seleucid for the first, Nekartar. They all gave themselves these additional names, who ruled from 312 to 281. Now, Syria is not mentioned in anything in Scripture at this time because no such nation as Syria really existed. I'm using Syria as a reference to the location of that northern group, just simply to help the modern reader place it where it should be. The Seleucids of the north eventually controlled everything from Asia Minor, that's modern Turkey, to India, and in time became stronger than Ptolemy in the south. In this verse 5, that historical fact is prophesied of the emergence of Ptolemy as ruler over Egypt. And almost in code, it tells us of the Seleucid emergence over Syria. One of his princes will gain power over him and have dominion. His dominion will be a great dominion. See, Seleucus had been a commander under Ptolemy in Alexander's chain of command. Thus, he became a prince to Ptolemy when Ptolemy succeeded Alexander and became king. He was no longer a commander under him. He was now a prince under him, as was ruling. But Seleucus would expand his power in the north until he equaled, at times exceeded, the power of Ptolemy in the south. And this verse 5 lays the basis for these two lines of rulers that we're going to follow now through the rest of this chapter, and that they would be rivals with little Israel stuck between them as they fought battles back and forth. Not a good place to be with the armies of two powers fighting back and forth over you, each seeking to control Alexander's old empire. Pay close attention now to what goes on from here, because this is where the real detail, we've seen a lot of detail given in prophecy that's happened in Scripture, but this is where the real detail, prophetic section of all Scripture, it's the most in all Scripture, comes in. Daniel 11:6, please. After a number of years, they will form alliance. That's the northern and the southern. The daughter of the king of the south will approach the king of the north to make an agreement. But she won't retain her power, and his power won't last either. Rather, she will be surrendered, along with her attendants, her father, and one who supported her during those times. Now, frankly, that makes absolutely no sense until you wrap it around history that happened that makes that real. Okay? Following Seleucus I, there was a king of the north in Syria called Antiochus I Soltar, who ruled from 281 to 261, who is skipped over in our narrative. That's why it says at the start of verse 6, after a number of years. This first king isn't important to the prophecy. So we drop down to Antiochus II in the north, Syria, and the king in the south, Egypt, called Ptolemy II Philadelphus. Now we have to follow this closely in history. A marriage takes place between an Egyptian princess. This actually happened in history. A marriage takes place between an Egyptian princess named Bernice, who was the daughter of Ptolemy II Philadelphus, and Antiochus II Theos, king of the north. Antiochus Theos ruled from 261 to 246. The marriage occurred about 242, historically speaking. The marriage was consummated at the demand of Ptolemy II, king of the south, who required Antiochus II to divorce his wife, Laodice, and marry Bernice. This actually happened in history. It was a political marriage, and the reason was to make an alliance between these two states, the north and the south. Now, look at this phrase here. It says fifth line down, but she won't retain her power, and his power won't last either. Ptolemy II of Egypt dies after a few years. Antiochus II of Syria then abandons Bernice and took back Laodice. She shall not retain her power. She didn't, because after her dad died, the king that was forced to marry her kicked her out and brought back his original wife. All right, this has happened historically. But to gain revenge over the divorce, Laodice murders Bernice. She really won't retain her power. And she murders Antiochus II. His power will not last either. And their infant son. She killed all three of them, murdered all three of them. See the soap opera effect? It keeps getting better. Daniel 11, verses 7 through 9. But another branch from the same root as her, see, we're going back to Bernice. Another branch from the same root as hers will appear in her father's place. It's a brother that succeeds her father. He will attack the army of the king of the north, enter his fortress, and succeed in conquering them. Next. He will also carry off his booty to Egypt, their gods, their cast metal images, their valuable gold and silver vessels. Then for some years he will retain from attacking the king of the north. Afterwards the king of the north will invade the kingdom of the king of the south, but he will retire to his own land. Bernice's brother, who became Ptolemy III, ruled from 246 to 221, succeeded his father's king of Egypt, king of the south. To avenge his sister's mercy, he marches north and defeats the Syrian army. He invades Syria and puts Laodice, the bad queen, to death, and conquers a large area of the Seleucid state. Carried back, we know from history, 40,000 talents of gold and silver, 2,500 idols. The king of Egypt remained more powerful than the king of Syria for a long time, but in 240, the new king of Syria, Seleucus II Callinicus, retaliates by invading Egypt. He was defeated and returned home. Now, and this really fulfills this prophecy of Daniel 11, 7 through 9. But can you imagine all this? All this in history is actually closely following the prophecy that was given to Daniel back in chapter 11, or in chapter 11 that we're going through. Also consider this. Wouldn't this make a script for a long-running soap opera? I just want us to kind of have this in mind. This seems so foolish, but yet it actually happened out there in the world. Daniel 11:10. His sons will rouse themselves to muster a large and powerful army which will advance like a flood passing through. In another campaign, it will march on the enemy stronghold. This is a lousy translation. It's Stearns, and it isn't very good, so I'm going to read you a better one that's out of the Art Scroll Stone Edition Tanakh. Then the northern king's sons, plural, will stir themselves up and gather a multitude of great armies. Then it says, he, note the change from plural to singular, will launch an attack, inundate, and pass through. Then he will once again stir himself up right in the south stronghold. That's what the Hebrew is closer to saying than what we got in this translation. What happened here is the king of Syria, Seleucus II, had two sons. One was Seleucus III, the other was Antiochus III, who became Antiochus the Great. Seleucus III ruled from 226 to 223, only 3 years. Then Antiochus III ruled from 283 to 187. And these two men together built this large army. However, Seleucus III was killed in an early battle in Asia Minor, so Antiochus III took full charge of the army, Antiochus the Great. And that's the plural first part of the verse changing to the singular in the last part, of the second part of the verse. Overall, this prophecy is so detailed that it takes into consideration the death of that one man. That detail in the Hebrew is not reflected in the Stern translation or in the NIV translation. We have to actually go into the Hebrew to look at it. Antiochus III made a rapid conquest, retook Syrian territory held by Egypt, and by 219 he had conquered into parts of Israel and Transjordan, which is why it was bad for Israel to be between these two, because they were constantly fighting battles over Israel. After a brief rest, Antiochus III went on the offensive again and went against Egyptians' fortress called Raphia at Israel's border with Egypt. Egypt's Ptolemy IV sat idly by, involved in a life of luxury and ease, right up until this attack came. Daniel 11, verses 11 and 12, please. The king of the south, enraged, will set out to do battle with the king of the north, who in turn will muster a large army, but this army will be defeated by his enemy and carried off. The conqueror will grow proud as he slaughters tens of thousands, yet he will not prevail. So in 217 BCE, when Antiochus III went against the Egyptian fort of Raphia, Ptolemy IV got angry and assembled an army, and it consisted of 70,000 infantrymen, we know from history, 50,000 cavalry, we know from history, 73 elephants. And he marched against Antiochus III. Antiochus had 72,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and 102 elephants. This was a major skirmish. In 217 BCE, the armies clashed at Raphia. Egypt won a great victory. Antiochus lost 10,000 infantry, 3,000 cavalry, and 5 elephants, and had 4,000 men captured. But then Ptolemy IV became very proud over his victory, but he didn't prevail. He didn't press his advantage. He went back to his life of ease, which was a big mistake. Continuing on, Daniel 11:13. Rather, the king of the north will again muster an army larger than the first one at the end of this period, after a number of years. It will be a large, well-supplied army. It will be times in which many will resist. Those will be times in which many will resist the king of the south, and the more violent ones among your own people will rebel in order to fulfill their vision, but they will fail. Then the king of the north will come, set up siege works, capture a fortified city. The forces of the south will be insufficient defense. Even his elite troops will not be strong enough. In 2003 BC, Egypt's Ptolemy IV and his queen died very mysteriously. They were succeeded by their infant son Ptolemy V Epiphanes. He became king of Egypt at age 4. Now, do you think that might not have tripped off the king of the north? Antiochus III of Syria saw this and felt now it was the time to retaliate for their loss at Raphia. The old king is dead. They've got a 4-year-old king on the throne. Now's my chance. Antiochus had developed a large army in the 14 years since the defeat at Raphia, so he marched on Egypt. This time he didn't fight alone, though. He had made league with Philip V of Macedonia. He'd also made league with Egyptian rebels who were opposed to their child king. And there were also Jewish men described as men of violence who were involved in this because they resented Egyptian influence that had been exerted over Israel for all of this period of time. Verse 15 says, Then the king of the north will come, set up siege works, and capture a fortified city. The forces of the south will be in sufficient defense. Even his elite troops will not be strong enough to resist. 198, Antiochus III besieged and conquered the fortress city of Sidon. The leading Egyptian general there, who was named Scopius, was defeated. 3 attempts to rescue him failed historically. These 3 rescue attempts were led by 3 specially chosen Egyptian generals and by elite troops. This defeat ended Egyptian rule over Israel. Daniel 11:16. The invader will do as he pleases. No one will be able to withstand him, so he will establish himself in the land of glory, and he will have the power to destroy it. The invader is the king of the north. The land of glory here, is Israel. At this time, Antiochus III of the north of Syria had no opposition. It was Antiochus the Great. He could do as he pleased for some time all over the Middle East, and he came to Israel and took complete control of the land. Took it over completely. Israel was completely in his hands, but Antiochus III treated the Jews very well. He released Jerusalem from taxes for 3 years and sent money into them to do work on the temple. He was building himself a case of, I'm the good guy, and the guy I've just beaten that you've had ruling over you for all this time was the bad guy. Notice now how all these things that have happened in history are falling right on top of the prophecy that was given. Daniel 11:17. He will determinedly advance with full force of his kingdom, but he will make an agreement with the king of the south and give him a daughter in marriage. His object will be to destroy him, but the agreement will not last or work out in his favor. He, that's the king of the north, will advance full force of his kingdom, but he will make an agreement with the king of the south and give him a daughter in marriage. His object will be to destroy him, but the agreement will not work out in his favor. At this time, around 198 BC, the power of Rome had begun to rise in the area, and the Fourth Empire was beginning to raise its ugly head. And it actually threatened these Syrian Greeks. It threatened their expansionist program. And because of this, Antiochus III decided it was too risky to invade Egypt again, deciding that it would be better to control Egypt by treaty. So at this time, Syria's kingdom was very large, which made Egypt very much agreeable to such a treaty. Antiochus of Syria had a daughter named Cleopatra. Ever heard that name before? Well, this lady would have been the grandmother of the Cleopatra that Mark Antony and Caesar messed around with. And Ptolemy the Fourth of Egypt was a young unmarried man. So a treaty was struck by marriage in 197 BCE. Ptolemy the Fourth would have been about 10 years old at the time that he was married to the daughter of the king of the north. Antiochus III's intention was that his daughter would work for him against her husband. See, gave him a daughter's marriage. His object was to destroy the king of the south. But look, it says, but the agreement will not last or work out in his favor. Well, the problem was Cleopatra constantly sided with her Egyptian husband against her Syrian father. All this laid out for us in history, and therefore it fulfilled this prophecy. Again, are we noting how accurately history has fulfilled these prophecies? And I keep bringing this up because we need to keep our focus on this. This is so accurately prophesied that history has verified it exactly to the point. And this is really just incredible to the mind who doesn't know God. It just couldn't have happened this closely. Anyway, sometimes blood is thicker than water, and Antiochus III was dealing with an independent-minded daughter who evidently became fond of her husband. Daniel 11, verses 18 and 19. Next, this is the king of the north, will put his attention on the coastlands and the islands and capture many. But an army commander will put a stop to his outrages because his outrages and cause his outrages to come back upon him. After this, he will put his attention on strongholds in his own land, but he will stumble, fall, and not be seen again. We're still talking about Antiochus III, Antiochus the Great. Beginning in 197 BCE, Antiochus conquered some Aegean Sea islands, actually did it, some portions of Asia Minor, Thrace, and parts of Greece. The complication is that these areas were areas that the rising Roman Empire wanted to control. And so they were butting heads, and Antiochus the Great boasted about what he was going to do to Rome's interests. Big mistake. There is, in fact, a writing that speaks of the scornful treatment that Antiochus heaped on the Roman ambassador to him. There was a meeting where Antiochus boastfully said, quote, Asia did not concern them, meaning Rome, and he was not subject to their orders, unquote. So when this word got back to Rome, they sent out a general, Lucius Cornelius Scipio, who in 191 threw Antiochus out of Greece. The next year he defeated Antiochus soundly in the Battle of Magentia in Asia Minor, and this fulfills the prophecies of verse 18, which tells us that this was the end of anything that Persia had to do with Europe. Antiochus retreated to his own land, defeated and broken. The last part of verse 19 being fulfilled when he was killed in 187 BC while trying to rob a temple in Elana in order to replenish his exhausted treasury. Daniel 11:20. In his place will arise one who will send a tax collector through the glorious kingdom, that's Israel again, but within a few days he will be broken, though neither in anger nor in battle. This really gets to be another soap opera episode. Antiochus III was succeeded by his son Seleucus IV Philopator. The Romans required him to pay 1,000 talents annually in taxes. In order to raise that kind of money, Seleucus had to tax all the inhabitants in the lands under him, including special taxes from the Jews, collected by a tax collector named Helidorus, who gets a mention in 2 Maccabees 3:7. Helidorus took treasures from the temple in Jerusalem in order to meet his requirements to pay his taxes to Rome. Short time after this, Seleucus IV suddenly and mysteriously died in 176 BC. They think possibly poisoned. In verses 31 through 35 coming up now, we're only going to deal with one man, and that is Antiochus IV Theos Epiphanes. And these are, I think, astounding verses in Scripture. This man is probably the most complete picture of the coming false Messiah that there is. If we pay attention to what Scripture says of this man and what history tells us of this man, we, I believe, will be further equipped to recognize the coming false Messiah. This is the man that desecrated the temple, and Yeshua talks about the coming Messiah desecrating the temple, being like this one that preceded him. All of these verses, all of this space is devoted to showing us what Antiochus Epiphanes is all about. And this has to be important for all this space to be devoted to him. It's a huge amount. And again, this is a key to recognizing, I believe, the coming false Messiah. And if we take note that when we get there, in the changing of our reading from verse 35 to verse 36, we will switch from the Scripture talking about Antiochus Theos Epiphanes to talking about the coming false Messiah. It takes place right there. We quit talking about the past. I think that we're starting to build towards that. I think there's a purpose for this build out that way so that we can hit that time of completion about Antiochus Epiphanes and start immediately into looking at the one that he's a type and foreshadow of. Daniel 11:21, please. There will arise in his place, this is Antiochus the Great, a despicable man not entitled to inherit the majesty of the kingdom, but he will come without warning and gain the kingdom by intrigue. Large armies will be broken and swept away before him, as well as the Prince of the Covenant. Prince of the Covenant, pay attention to that. That's the high priest. Alliances will be made with him. He will undermine them by deceit. Then he will have a small following, but he will emerge and become strong. These verses, and up to verse 35, are devoted to talking about a relatively obscure Syrian king who reigned from 175 to 164. He is the one that is previously alluded to as the little horn in Daniel 8, 9 through 14, and 23 through 25. He's the one who pops up from the four that succeed Alexander. Now, from the standpoint of Scripture, from the revelation of the angel to Daniel, this is the most important feature of the entire Third Empire of man. The reason for this is Antiochus Theos Epiphanes desecrated the temple in Jerusalem and its altar and led the bitter persecution of the Jewish people. The title that Antiochus gave himself was Theos Epiphanes, meaning God made manifest. God's view of him is stated in verse 21 that he was despicable. Some translations say vile. His conduct was so contemptible that his contemporaries nicknamed him Epimenimus, meaning madman, rather than the self-imposed title of Theos Epiphanes. This guy called himself God made manifest, but God says he's not even entitled to this kingdom. He comes without warning. He gains a kingdom by intrigue. He seizes the throne rather than gaining it honorably. At the time Seleucus IV died, there were several possible candidates for that northern kingdom's throne. The most legitimate ruler would have been Demetrius, Seleucus IV's young son, who was being held by Rome as a hostage of state, who was also an infant son of Seleucus, who was named Antiochus, of all things. And Antiochus IV Epiphanes, brother of Seleucus IV, was in Athens at that time of his brother's death, posing as a guardian of the infant Antiochus, son of his brother. Antiochus IV went directly from Athens to Antioch, where by various manipulations secured the throne. The infant Antiochus in Athens was murdered by a man named Andronicus, who Antiochus Epiphanes in turn put to death, so he tidied up after himself. It's believed that Antiochus Epiphanes really hatched the whole plot. Helogarus, who had murdered Antiochus Epiphanes' brother Seleucus IV, disappears. Everybody involved in this power grab is either murdered or disappears. Anyone who could be opposition to Antiochus Epiphanes or cause him trouble, that included his brother's sons, disappears. Early in Antiochus Epiphanes' rule, Egypt prepared an army to march against him. When Antiochus Epiphanes learned of this, he marched the Syrian army south to attack the Egyptians, and they completely routed the Egyptians in 170 BCE. Battle took place on the Mediterranean coast about halfway between Gaza and the Nile Delta, across the northern edge of the Sinai Peninsula. Now, see this little thing about the Prince of the Covenant being swept away at the end of verse 22. That's the high priest in Israel's temple. Antiochus Epiphanes, as he comes back and takes control of Jerusalem, allowed Onias, high priest of Israel, at the temple in Jerusalem to be disposed and replaced by Onias' brother Jason. But Onias opposed this. It's in 2 Maccabees 4, 7 through 15. I brought some copies of the Apocrypha and marked them if you'd like to look at how that took place. It was his responsibility, Jason's, to see that Israel remained true to the covenant with God. But in 172 BCE, Antiochus Epiphanes ordered the murder of Onias. Verse 23 describes Antiochus' various political associations with other nations, especially Egypt, which involved considerable intrigue and deceit. Alliances will be made with him, but he will undermine them by deceit. Then, although he will have but a small following, he will emerge and become strong. He offered friendship to Egypt in order to get it to let down his guard against him. When he accomplished this, he gained control of Egypt. He did this, of course, through deceitful means. Despite the small size in which Rome had reduced the Syrian state, Antiochus began to rise in power. Daniel 11:24, please. Without warning, he will assail the most powerful men in each province and do things his predecessors never did. Either recently or in the distant past, he will reward them with plunder, spoil, and wealth while devising plots against their strongholds, but only for a time. Next. He will summon his power and courage against the king of the south with a great army, and the king of the south will fight back with a very great and powerful army, but he will not succeed because of plots devised against him. Yes, those who shared his food will destroy him, his army will be swept away, and many will fall in the slaughter. In verse 24, Antiochus robs the wealthiest part of his kingdom at a time when they didn't expect to be plundered. But he didn't squander this money on himself. He used it to buy favors with others to secure their cooperation. This is mentioned to us in 1 Maccabees 3:30. Among his military maneuvers were several expeditions against Egypt, as indicated in verse 25. This prophecy is simply describing in general the characteristics of the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes. The outcome was that the king of the south was defeated, as indicated in verses 25 through 26, because of the plots devised against him, that those who shared his food would destroy him, that those that should have stood with him as the king of Egypt conspired against him. And the end result was Antiochus Epiphanes being victorious in Egypt. Intriguingly, this helps to define the coming false Messiah. Daniel 11:27. These two kings, bent on mischief, sat at the same table speaking lies to each other, but none of this will succeed because the appointed end will not have come yet. Then the king of the north will return to his own land with great wealth, with his heart set against the holy covenant. He will take action and then return home. What happened here is Antiochus the fourth and Ptolemy the sixth battled each other with huge armies when Antiochus invaded the Egyptian territories. Men in Ptolemy the sixth court plotted against him during this invasion by Antiochus. Eventually Ptolemy the sixth was captured by Antiochus. When this occurred, some Egyptians crowned Ptolemy the sixth brother, Ptolemy the seventh, as king of Egypt in Alexandria. In light of this new development, Antiochus pretended he would befriend Ptolemy the sixth, who he just defeated and was his prisoner. He was his enemy. But now he's his friend in order to gain his help against his brother, Ptolemy the seventh. Are we following the soap opera here? Now, they will sit at the same table speaking lies to each other. Whoa. These two men, according to Daniel's prophecy, will sit at the same table speaking lies to each other. What does Daniel's prophecy say? Antiochus promises to reconquer Egypt for Ptolemy the sixth from his brother Ptolemy the seventh and put Ptolemy the sixth back on the throne. And if you believe that, I got a bridge up in New York City that's for sale. Both these guys, Antiochus Epiphanes and Ptolemy the sixth, planned to use the other one to gain control of Egypt. Antiochus conquered Memphis, but failed to take Alexander. So Antiochus went home, leaving Ptolemy the sixth ruling from Memphis and Ptolemy the seventh ruling from Alexandria. Two kings over Egypt at that time. All right. Why did the thing with Antiochus Epiphanes and Ptolemy the sixth fail? It states it right here. The appointed end will not have come yet. But none of this will succeed, the plotting that they did, because the appointed end will not have come yet. God's indignation with Israel is not yet finished. God is not yet through with having Israel slapped for what they have been doing. So the wars between Syria and Egypt are not yet to come to an end. You have to remember that Israel is in between these two. These armies work their way back and forth across the land of Israel. Even if they aren't fighting physically on the land, they're foraging off of it. That's how an army of that nature would travel. They didn't carry their mess tents and so forth. They went out and robbed your garden as they came by. This had to be a miserable experience at best for Israel. And kind of in the interim, something happened in Jerusalem. Antiochus has replaced Jason, the high priest, with Menelaus because Menelaus offered Antiochus more tribute money. Well, Jason got replaced because he was willing to pay Antiochus more money. So we're now in a situation whereby the high priesthood of God is for sale in his temple in Jerusalem. And this is laid out in 2 Maccabees 4, 23 through 27. The high priesthood of God's temple is now for sale. Jason also hears a false rumor from Egypt that Antiochus is dead. So Jason raises a Jewish force to overthrow Menelaus. But Menelaus beats off this attack, internal fighting in Israel. Meanwhile, Antiochus is on his way home with his army and his booty from Egypt, and he determines it's time to teach these rebel Jews a lesson. Those who followed Jason, he slaughtered, many of them, sold many of them into slavery, plundered the temple. We've looked at that at Hanukkah many times. He really plundered the temple, turned it into a place where pigs were slaughtered and put on the sacrificial altar of the temple of God. It's really huge. But he plundered the temple and he carried off the sacred items to Syria, this showing his contempt for Israel's covenant relationship with God. Remember that we're looking now at the most detailed prophecy in all of Scripture. Historically, we know that it is absolutely correct because, as we've taken a lot of time tonight to lay out and prove the points, it has consistently happened as Daniel was told that it was going to happen. What this is trying to show us, I believe, is about a Gentile ruler that will come to power suddenly through intrigue and underhanded methods. Will hold absolute sway over Israel, Jerusalem, and the Temple Mount is a picture for us of someone that's coming in the future. And at verses 34 and 35 again, we will go from something that was 200 years in the past to looking at a matching Gentile ruler to that man in our future, who will be the last Gentile ruler of the world, that will hold absolute power over Israel, Jerusalem, and the Temple Mount. The one type and foreshadowed by Antiochus Epiphanes. Now we're going to stop right here and finish this chapter next week.